Looking for a therapist that won't drive you crazy? Get some tips on Gnostic-friendly mental health care on this episode of Talk Gnosis. Welcome to Talk Gnosis for October 23rd, 2013. I'm Bishop Ken Canterbury, and joining me as usual is my lovely co-host, Bishop Lainey Peterson. Hello, Lainey. How are you this evening?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you, Bishop Ken?
I'm really good, and I'm pretty excited about tonight's show. I think it's a pretty interesting subject. You want to tell us about what tonight's show is?
Sure. Tonight's topic is mental health care for esotericists. And joining us is Alan Salmi, a Chicago-based clinical social worker and esotericist. Alan holds a master's degree in social work and has been trained in a variety of therapy modalities. He is also a professional astrologer. Welcome, Alan.
Welcome, Alan.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
We're looking forward to this show, and we're just going to dive right in. So what are some of the challenges that the esoterically inclined face when seeking out mental health care?
Well, I think part of it is it's exemplified by a couple that I ran into once at a party. Mm-hmm. And I told them a little bit about me, and I said, since I know about these things, I'm a Hermeticist myself, and I said, what do you think of offering services to people in the magical community? And they said, well, we're a married couple. We have an open relationship. We're bisexual and we're witches. Where do you think we'll go that anyone will understand us?
Sure.
Yeah, we've got a point there. I think part of it is that, well, certain problems are can be really focused. If you're going to see somebody to quit smoking or something, you don't have to talk about your faith particularly. Mm-hmm. But to be able to find someone who can understand or at least accept and not have pejorative thinking about it, especially when you're in any minority faith, it can be a bit of a stretch for some folks.
Sure. I mean, you could have a situation where a therapist is willing to throw magical thinking at somebody who is, practicing magic or who is meditating or that sort of thing. That's a real possibility in some cases, do you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then you have people who, you never know when you have someone whose own religion is really rigid, and they think they have to call children and family services because somebody is a witch or because they're doing rituals in their home. We're supposed to be culturally aware in all of the mental health professions. Not many people are, or not many people collect religions, as I call it, to get a broad viewpoint on things.
Sure, that could be a really serious situation, particularly if somebody does have children. I had never even thought about that. So it kind of segueing in there, so how honest should people be with therapists regarding their spiritual and religious practices and beliefs? Do you have to feel somebody out ahead of time, or do you think people should be direct and say, hey, I'm a pagan, or I'm a Hermeticist, or I'm a Gnostic? Is that going to be an issue in our therapy? What do you recommend?
Well, part of it depends on how good your referral is, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. If you are referred by somebody who, obviously knows and has worked with other people in the community, that's a different matter. But somebody straight up, it can be a little challenging. I think, certainly asking them about what they think of religion, how does what's their viewpoint on it? Have they worked with a minority faith at all? But you could always be on the safe side and, instead of spell, say prayer, ritual, you can talk about, a prayer gathering or something, sort of translated into their terms. If you're doing very deep kind of work, which in some instances you would, depending on the person's method, you would have to let them know more about your faith. But where you're doing that kind of work would be with an analyst or something in that line, and hopefully they'd be more aware. You just have to be a little bit careful, and I think that sense of feeling out and gaining trust. Just like I tell people at work, don't let people no, like first day on the job, hi, I'm a neo-pagan hermeticist, and I go to big pagan festivals and dance naked around the bonfire. Get people to know you first as a person, and then when they find these interesting things out about you, you have some cushion there, a foundation for the relationship. And so you could do the same thing with your therapist.
Mm-hmm. I think that's good advice right there.
Mm-hmm.
This next question, that we have for you is, do you think as a therapist, do you see kind of discerning between psychosis and genuine kind of spiritual experience? How difficult is that for you as a therapist? The reason I ask is that it's kind of a cliche, I think, within our community that there's a fine line between mental illness and spiritual attainment. Many of the symptoms, if you will, of enlightenment sometimes can be kind of borderline psychosis for some people. And I think that sometimes it's even hard for the initiate to kind of discern those things. Do you think a therapist can help someone kind of make those things clear?
Well, that's where you would have to get somebody pretty esoterically inclined, especially if you're doing practices. Part of the reason why I think old Gerald Gardner put into his whole thing with Wicca is you shouldn't be a witch alone, because think of all the experiences people have, and you need to check out with the community. Are you going off on the deep end, or are these genuine visions, things like that? And being able to have a context where that kind of thing is held. I mean, even certain cultures, when people had those things that are considered deviant now, oftentimes they were honored as being, prophets or voices of the god. If you look at folks with gender identity problems, as they're calling it now, but if you're in Native American tradition, you were two-spirited and it wasn't seen as problematic. So, yeah, it can be a little tricky. I think one of the things to do, though, is to look at it in the context of everything. I had a young woman come to me once who, she had a very troubled life at times, but she started to have these visions. And I said, well, what's going on when you're processing film in your darkroom? And she said, well, I have this woman with the head of a lion showing up and talking to me and saying, okay, you are mine. And I asked her a few other questions, and I found out that one of the essential things that she had happening was a particular way in which the vision was shown to her, in which this goddess showed up. And I knew that she was being taken by Sekhmet. And I said, you need to see somebody, and I'm going to introduce you to someone who can explain this to you. So someone else would have had a very difficult time, with that or understanding it. But I saw it in the context of the bigger process. And she went from, actually her life has transformed because of her magical work. She was a grade D student in high school and now is getting a master's in nursing.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. So being able to get a hand on these things, find the right referrals and whatnot. If somebody's had a long time of breaks, or if they have difficulties that especially show up in their early 20s or late teens, that's considered a pretty classic time for a psychotic break. You would check with an expert on some of that just to be on the safe side. If somebody's having visions more in their 40s and they've been working spiritually for years and they finally make a breakthrough, they're doing their Enochian magic and they, find some spirit who's speaking back to them or something. If it's in the context, still have to kind of ride herd on that experience and give the person good advice on how to integrate it into their life.
So would you also be looking at things like how that person is otherwise functioning? Yes, they may be having these visions or these magical results, but they're also getting up in the morning, going to their job, getting dressed, bathing, that sort of thing. That would be something that you would be looking at as their overall functionality.
Yeah, it's funny, and I'm sure anybody who's been in the esoteric scene for a while has met these people who claim to have their top chakras open, but they can barely, tie their shoes in the morning.
Right.
As my own spiritual teacher says, I would rather have my bottom chakras functioning so that I can work and have a living, as opposed to be blown open by things. In the case of the woman with the goddess segment, we actually shut down her psychic abilities for a year in order to teach her to ground again.
Okay.
Yeah, but you have to see it in the bigger context of everything of what's happening. Now, keep in mind, some people who are born naturally psychic have a harder time because of society and acceptance. So you can run into things where people are open that way, or they are blown open by circumstances. There's a psychiatrist who wrote about it. He calls it spiritual emergency. And some people are trained in looking at these things, energy running up the spine and that sort of thing. That's pretty specialized, but I think it's a good thing to keep your eyes open for and to see in the broader context.
Particularly if you have somebody who seems to be using their spirituality, esoteric or Gnostic spirituality, as a way of avoiding responsibility, or taking responsibility for their day-to-day life. That would be something to keep a real eye out for.
And actually, I have a book recommendation on that.
Please.
My spiritual teacher just read this book. She had worked with Dr. Robert R.E.L. Masters, who married to Jean Houston. He wrote Mind Games and The Goddess Segment and whatnot. And she was looking for some of his books online, but came across Robert Augustus Masters, an entirely different person. But she picked up this book called Spiritual Bypassing. And what that's about is these people who get totally tied up in the spiritual world and forget to ground themselves in the real world. And so I would recommend that. I still have to get and order it, but it comes on good authority, at least to me, that it's part of that whole thing is how many people are using stuff to avoid those basic responsibilities in life. And really, what are we here for? It's to learn those basics and then to expand into the transcendent.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that recommendation. I saw that book a while back. It looked interesting. I need to get it. Maybe we can talk about it on the show sometime, Bishop Ken.
Yeah, because, it's one of the things that I think we've all noticed, if you've been around long enough, is that, people who do seem very spiritually enlightened, but they don't seem very well grounded. They seem kind of misplaced in time, if you will, and almost seems like the rest of their lives are in chaos. So I think that's a pretty good recommendation. I appreciate that. I have a question that we don't have on the list, but a few things that you have mentioned several times now is, looking for like a good referral. I know probably not a discussion we want on the show, but, with people's various insurance, whether it's upcoming insurance or whether it's their current policies, sometimes you're very limited on what your referrals can be. I know myself, when I was seeking some help from a mental health care specialist, I was looking for specific things. I was looking for a doctor, and I had maybe 3 choices. My insurance, Cigna, gave me maybe 3 choices in my area. I mean, total therapists might have been a total of maybe 20 that I had to choose from, which puts it, I think, on very limited basis. I mean, if Lainey says, hey, come see my friend so-and-so, they may not be part of my network. So how difficult does that even become for a, even more so, I think, for the esoteric minded person to try to find a decent therapist, because sometimes those resources are extremely limited, I think, to the patient.
Mm-hmm. It is difficult. I mean, and mental health has been gutted to a certain extent. From what I understand, the Affordable Care Act will be returning mental health benefits to a lot of people, and that will actually help things to a great extent. I think part of it is you have to get a kind of sense of what the different areas are and what their specialties are. So sometimes you can tell something from the person's brief biography. Mm-hmm. Sometimes if they're an MD versus a PhD, you can get a little bit of a different sense there. But yeah, I would say that that's an instance where it's better to get something than nothing. And it's better to build that foundation before you talk to somebody about your faith. sometimes, yeah, you are really stuck with things because of those kinds of limitations, and it's really difficult. I do know, though, that most of the people, of the few therapists that I know who are on the esoteric side, I would say that if you go to them and you say, look, can you do something on a sliding scale? Because, I know that you're, a ritual magician or a pagan or whatever. Most of them, I think, would stretch and give people a hand in that sense. I know that I certainly do. I would prefer to work with people who are esoterically inclined because I understand them. They're my people, and so I do some deep discounts at times, just so that I'm able to work with them. And because we have that common language, oftentimes the results are better or faster, because a lot of the esoteric training is really good training for being able to do the kind of work that you do in psychotherapy.
Sure. Just to wrap up here, and I'm sorry I don't have a lot of time, but Alan, what advice do you have to esoteric and Gnostic clergy about referring our parishioners or group members for professional mental health care?
Well, one of the things that I would say is take and learn just briefly the different types of people who offer mental health care. And there's lots of them, okay? For instance, a psychiatrist is the only type that could give medications. That's what they do. But they're not as well trained anymore in doing actual talk therapy. Some of them are, but the newer ones are all biologically oriented. That's the way that the drug companies and everything have been pushing them, and their training. A psychologist can either be a PhD or a PsyD. Usually they're focused in on talk and management. Find out some people who might be good at that and look in your area. Are any of them saying that they do transpersonal psychology or things in that line? You can get some clues in that sense. And family therapists, interestingly enough, are often overlooked, but because family therapy has some of its roots actually in anthropology, some of them have a wider perspective, and oftentimes you'll find that some of the interventions they make, it doesn't matter as much to them as the culture from the way that they see things. And I oftentimes say, if everything else is equal, a marriage and family therapist, even if you're an individual, is a good choice for you. Other master's degrees in counseling. You have people with master's degrees in nursing, but they're psychiatric nurses. And then you have folks like me. I'm a master's level social worker, and we're actually the largest mental health practitioners number-wise in the country. We provide the most. But again, it can be potluck there, because there are some good schools, some bad schools. Some people do a lot of continuing ed, others don't. And some of them can be just as opinionated as anyone average person. So you have to be a little bit careful there, although social workers are supposed to be culturally aware. So, learn what those kinds of sources are. And I would say, if you're going to be doing pastoral care, find a few people in your area before you need it.
Absolutely. Always wise.
Very good advice.
All right. I'm sorry we do have to wind up, but Alan, thank you so much for being on the show. I do have a little bit of news. We're going to be having a special show on November the 13th. We're going to have a viewer question program where you can send in your questions, and Bishop Ken and I will do our best to answer them. And you can email your questions to talkgnosis@gnosticnyc.com, and we look forward to getting your questions. And once again, Alan, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I think you've probably helping a lot of folks, both clergy and lay people, and all kinds of folks with your insights here. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you online?
It's real easy. I bought my own name. So you can go to alansalmi.com, ALAN, simplest way to spell it, SALMI, which I always say is one A short of being a sausage. So it's a Finnish name, SALMI. So it's alansalmi.com, and you can find me through there.
Okay.
Awesome.
Great.
Thank you. Again, we appreciate your feedback. You can find us on Facebook at Talk Gnosis on Facebook. You can also find us on YouTube. You can also always email your comments to talkgnosis@gnosticnyc.com. Coming up next week on Talk Gnosis is we are going to be continuing our series on diet and spirituality, this time with Bishop Philip Garver of the Église Gnostique, and he joins us to discuss the rigors of the Cathar diet. Should be a pretty interesting show.
Absolutely. And as always, this has been a production of the Gnostic NYC Network. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends, click the like button, and subscribe to our channel. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the views of Gnostic NYC or any other organization. No animals were harmed during the production of this show. For more Talk Gnosis, tune in every Wednesday for a new episode. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.